Okay, welcome to WLT Off the Bean and Craft Literature and Translation with Marian Schwartz. My name is Sam Babiak and I'm the Program Director for the Writers League of Texas. And before we dive into the presentation, I'll just read Marian's bio. Marian Schwartz has translated Russian classics such as Anna Karenina and Oblomov in contemporary fiction and nonfiction, including such authors as Mikhail Shishkin, Boguslav Nikova, and Leonid Yusufovich. I'm sorry if I'm butchering all of these names. She's the recipient of numerous honors, including 2 NEA Translation Fellowships, the 2014 Rita Russia Prize for Contemporary Literature, and the 2018 Linda Gabriel Award for Translation, awarded by the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity, and is a past president of the American Literary Translators Association. Her latest published translations are Alexander Solzhenitsyn's March 1917, The Red Wheel, Note 3, Book 3, and Nina Berberova's first novel, The Last and the First. Thank you so much, Marian, for being here. That is enough for me, but let me just switch over PowerPoints and Marian, take it away.
Great, thank you. Funny what comes up on your screen. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Writers League of Texas, for inviting me to speak here today. It's a real pleasure to speak to writers because translators are writers. We just are writing in a different genre with different goals and different circumstances. As Renato Pajoli said, the gifted translator is an alchemist who changes a piece of gold into another piece of gold, which highlights something I want to just as a assumption we're going to make here. When I talk about literary translations, I'm talking about good ones. I'm not going to talk about the bad ones. It's easy to talk about bad translations and probably not terribly helpful in this context. Obviously, literary translation is a huge topic. I'm going to give you a little overview about my career. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to write a literary translation, and then give you a little bit about the nuts and bolts of the profession. So as Sam said, I'm Marian Schwartz. I've been translating Russian literature for, nearly 50 years. And over those years, I've translated fiction and nonfiction. I've translated books in history, philosophy, fine arts, criticism, religion. I've translated biographies, but most of what I've translated has been fiction from the last 2 centuries, which is the bulk of Russian fiction in any case. Altogether, it probably comes to about 100 book-length texts that I've translated and published, plus, of course, a great many short stories. And those works some of them are classic. Classic, probably the best definition of a classic is something that survives and that gets, in the case of foreign literature, gets retranslated. I have a great commitment to contemporary Russian literature. I translate male authors, I translate female authors. During the period of the Soviet Union, which is when I first started out, I translated both works from the Soviet Union, written in the Soviet Union, and works written in the emigre world. Russian literature is probably a little different from many other literatures, in that there was this bifurcation. After the revolution, a great many writers left the country, and there was not a lot of contact between the Soviet Union and the emigre world, and the emigre world became its own offshoot, and is a very interesting phenomenon, and one I've always been interested in. So, as Sam said, probably the most famous book I've translated is Anna Karenina, which I published with Yale University Press. That's on the next slide. I came to Russian as a freshman at Harvard. I arrived at Harvard with every intention of studying mathematics, and then, studying some foreign languages too, because I like foreign languages. I already spoke French. And before I knew it, Russian and the language and the literature had sunk its claws deep in me, and I was really hooked. it was pathetic. I never took a math class at Harvard. So after I graduated from Harvard, I came to Austin. That's how I came to Texas the first time. I came here to get a master's in Slavic languages and literatures at UT. Although I was never intending to teach or be an academic, but I wanted that extra time with the language and with the literature. And while I was at UT, I met some very interesting people doing some very interesting translation work. It's where I was really first exposed to the notion of translation as something as part of my world. Nonetheless, after I got my master's, I went to New York. I thought I was going to work in publishing. I got a job as an assistant editor in a small academic publishing house in the city, and hadn't been there a month when another assistant editor at that house said, "Oh, my friend is starting a publishing house, and he wants a book translated from Russian. Would you do it?" Mind you, I had never translated a book before. This publisher knew nothing about me. This was an offer made in extreme ignorance, but I said yes. So I translated that at night, worked in the publishing house during the day. But I didn't last long in publishing. I really didn't care for office life. I don't know if many of you can relate to that. And I switched to freelancing, starting largely as a copy editor to support myself. Over the years, in the beginning, I did a lot more copy editing than translating. And then the mix switched until at a certain point, I just stopped copy editing at all. And in fact, the last copy editing years I spent worked copy editing translations because it was something I had a special expertise in. In a lot of ways, so far, this bio of mine could be the bio of a lot of writers. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if many of you have similar backgrounds. Many literary translators do all kinds of creative writing. They write original texts and they translate literary texts. Some are academics. Most, I don't know if they're most. In the old days, well, who knows? I don't have statistics on this, but there have always been academics who have translated. There have always been people like me who are freelancers who have translated. There's no one way, no one path to literary translation. What all translators do have in common, though, is that they're not just good readers, but they are very close readers. They're writers who are driven to write something in English that was not their original idea, in a style that may not be anything like their own style. Although obviously many translators gravitate towards writers to whom they feel a certain kinship. But this ability to drop your own preferences and delve deep into what the original author is trying to get at and how they are creating what they are creating is paramount for a literary translator. So we are good readers, we're close readers, we're also tend to be eclectic readers. We read not only in the foreign language that we translate, but we read widely in English. If you don't read a lot of different kinds of texts from a lot of different kinds of authors and eras and genres, you don't have an ear for the different possibilities in writing styles and devices and even kind of standard ways to approach different situations. So being a reader, yes, so you have to be a reader, but a translator, and a translator has to know the source, obviously has to know the source language. There are exceptions to that. There fine translations have been done by people who don't know the source language or claim not to know the source language. But interestingly enough, a translator does not need to be bilingual. And conversely, being bilingual does not make anyone a translator. It's great to be bilingual. It's very helpful. But on top of that, the bilingual person has to be educated in whatever language they're writing the translation. They may feel equally at home in two languages, but it's the language that they're educated in and that they've read most widely in that they will be the best translator for. That's the only way you can write a high quality text, is if you have been educated in the language you are. So this is the next slide. To be fluent in the source language, but fluent and literate in the target language. I would say that I'm fluent in Russian, but I'm certainly not bilingual. And one of the aspects of being at this level of language is knowing when I need to ask a question. When I don't fully understand what may be going on, I may not get an allusion, I may not understand an idiom, it could be any number of things depending on who the original translator was. So literary translators depend heavily on native speakers, on what we call informants. And one of my favorite informants is also a literary translator. He's in Moscow. He's a Russian who translates American and British literature into Russian. And when I first met him almost 40 years ago, he was translating Vonnegut. And it was actually kind of an interesting situation. He said, yes, I could come over. I was in Moscow and I had a little bit of a time, and I called him and he said, yes, you can come, but I only have a little bit of time. I've got half an hour, but come and let's meet. We'd been suggested that we meet each other because of our similar interests in translation. And he said, and he pulled out a list of questions. And I was delighted because I'm the one who's always asking native informants, cultural realia questions about holidays, all sorts of things, food, all kinds of questions I might have. And he was translating Vonnegut, and I can't remember all the questions, but I do remember one of the questions was, what is Korea Gate? Remember, this is like 1983. So there was no way that he would know what Korea Gate was. There was no internet. There was no way for him to find out. So he had to ask someone. So I explained to him what Korea Gate was, and he went through the rest of the questions. And the last question was, and who is Alfred E. Newman? And well, of course, that was a long explanation, but I assure you that the next person I knew who was going to Moscow brought several copies of Mad Magazine back with them for him. Over the years, I've given him many books of American literature that I like. I take pride in having introduced him to Paul Auster, who he is now the translator for into Russian. So I ask questions, and he's someone I have total trust in what his answer is going to be. It's not just his knowledge of Russian, but that he has an instant understanding of the gist of what my question is. So in slide 4, this is a book I did about Purges Night, or The Steps of the Commander. It's a book I translated for Yale University Press. They asked me to translate it. It was a book I didn't know, although I knew the author, Benedikt Yerofeyev, who is a very, he's a very famous writer. He's really a cult hero. He wrote a very famous book called From Moscow to Petushki. But this is different. This is a play, best likened probably to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It takes place in the psychiatric hospital. Of course, in the Soviet Union, in those days, psychiatric hospitals were used as a form of punishment for political dissidents. The main character who we see at the beginning is being admitted, not just admitted to this psych hospital, but actually readmitted. He has been there before, they know him there, and he, when he gets there, the nurse says to him, she knows him, and she says, you know, you'll do much better here if you stop speaking in Shakespearean iams. And indeed, if you look at the text, there are sections that look like verse. They're set out in lines. They look like verse. So my question was, I have many questions. This raises many questions. One of which is he actually speaking in Shakespearean iams? Maybe she's just saying he's speaking in Shakespearean iams. Or maybe he's speaking in them. That's the first question. The second question is, what is a Shakespearean iam in Russian? Because obviously he's not speaking in English iams, he's speaking in Russian iams, which are slightly different and are based on, well, they have canonical translations they have a few very famous translations of Shakespeare. And so they have their own sense of what a Shakespearean iam would be. And I needed to know, since I had never studied Shakespeare in Russian, I couldn't say, but my friend could say, Sergei could tell me. So I wrote to him and I said, is he speaking in, it was a very brief interchange, is he speaking in Shakespearean iams? And he wrote back, yes, he is. And I said, thank you. And that brings me to my earlier point about being educated in your target language, because then I had to reach into my Shakespeare experience. I've had a lot of education in Shakespeare, starting in high school. I have a pretty good sense of what Shakespeare sounds like and how his verse form works. So once I knew that I was dealing with something that should sound like Shakespeare, then I could translate it. But if I had not asked those questions, it would have been a mess. It would have been pointless. It wouldn't have said anything to anyone. I hope that the translation I did at least evokes Shakespeare. At least it is iambic pentameter and in some ways resembles Shakespearean iams. And this brings me to another question people sometimes ask. They wonder about the difference between literary translation and all the other kinds of translation. Obviously, there's commercial, there's legal, medical, patent, scientific, business. There's just as many ways as people write, there's translation for those kinds of writing. And all of those kinds of translation have their own stylistic requirements. They have their own norms, their own standards. What makes something literary is that the aesthetic element is, if not paramount, at least equal to the content. And the aesthetic is a creative aesthetic, and it requires creativity on the part of the translator to reproduce in the target language. So the literary translator has to have a very deep toolbox of what English can do and how it can do it. and what is standard in English and how you can stretch English in order to reproduce the original author's intent. So if we go to slide 5, the next slide, this is Envy, the cover of Envy with one line on it. Envy is a book I translated for New York Review Books, and it's a classic. It was written in the 20s in the Soviet Union. It's about a man who is not fitting into this whole concept of the new Soviet man. And so he decides that he is going to collect all the emotions that the new Soviet man doesn't need. So like a museum of outdated emotions. And the first one he wants to collect is envy, an example of envy. He never gets past envy, but that's the premise. And the first line of the book it's fairly short, and it's one of those books that is written in a very light tone. It's kind of bippy, but underneath there's incredible darkness. I find it extremely depressing book because it foretells what's going to come in the Soviet Union and what's going to happen to the culture and to people there. So the first line of this book really sets the tone for the book. And in Russian, it sounds like this. Он поет по утрам в туалете. Он поет по утрам в туалете. So it scans. Он поет по утрам в туалете. It's very rhythmic and short. Lots of Russian sentences are long. It's uncharacteristically short. If you were not concerned about the rhythm of it, and we're going to do kind of a not literal, maybe literal translation, you would say, he sings in the mornings in the lavatory. We've got that difficult word, toilette, which is, it's that room where the toilet is. It's not the bathroom. Bathroom's another room. The toilet is a separate room. At least the British have that. They've got the WC. I've seen translations of this that use WC for toilette. To be perfectly honest, I'm not even sure what a lavatory is. I know people use it for restroom. I'm not sure. I've never really pinned that one down. It's not a word I'd use. But in any case, whichever word you use, he sings in the mornings in the lavatory is a very clunky sentence in English. It's got 2 prepositional phrases in a row, which are more unwieldy in English because we have articles and Russian doesn't have articles. So there's no thes or a's or ands in Russian. An earlier translation than mine by Andrew McAndrew was much better. He said, mornings he sings in the lavatory. Well, at least he got rid of one prepositional phrase. Mornings he sings in the lavatory. It's also more English because it puts the adverb of time at the beginning of the sentence, which is where English likes it. But it's still not bippy. It's serviceable, but does nothing to set the tone, except for the idea of it. I really wanted to preserve that rhythm. So mine is mornings he sings on the toilet. I'm happy with it. Native speakers will sometimes berate me for saying that he's on the toilet because he was probably standing. To me, the rhythm of it and the tone of it outweighed the importance of whether he was sitting or standing at the time. Next slide. This is a great quote by Bruce Berland, who's now deceased. He was a translator from Hungarian. He says, "Why in the world should one want to be a translator? because of an irrepressible love of language and literature, first one's own literature, then others that call out to be heard in one's own language. Bruce was lucky. He knew literature, he knew Hungarian literature, and he knew what he wanted to translate. He translated poetry. Deciding what to translate is actually extremely difficult unless someone asks you to do something. If it's on your own initiative, it's nerve-wracking. It's just difficult to choose a text. As you can imagine, you're kind of torn between what you love and what you think someone else might love, what you think a publisher might love. There's no point doing a beautiful translation of a work that no one wants to read. And believe me, there have been many translations done of works that no one wants to read, or at least not enough people want to read. So how do you find something to translate? Very often, translators meet the author. Often when they're in a country of that author, or at some other event, they get to know the author, they establish a relationship, and the works come from that relationship. As I said, sometimes I'm traveling in that country. Sometimes these translator-author mashups happen in an academic setting. One of the great examples of that is the University of Iowa, which has an MFA in literary translation, but it also has the International Writing Program. So they will pair up people in the literary translation program with foreign writers who are going through the International Writing Program. Many very stable author-translator relationships have started there. Sometimes translators make connections and find things to translate by going to book fairs. The three main ones that I know of are the Frankfurt Book Fair, obviously is the biggest, the London Book Fair, and the Guadalajara Book Fair. They all, I know anecdotally of people who have gone to all three of those places, met publishers, met authors, found works to translate, specifically by going to those fairs. It can be very productive, but you can't always travel. So sometimes countries maintain lists of recently published books that will be almost in the form of proposals for getting those books translated. And those are through the cultural offices. The French Cultural Office has always done a very good job of that. So is the Goethe Institute, which is part of the German government, and many others have as well. Often countries, it seems like often small countries will go the extra mile to promoting their literature and attracting translators with trips to those countries. Korea does this with grants for translation. Next slide. So another route, and probably one of the most important routes for projects, is through English language editors who acquire the rights to publish translations. It's funny, but no matter how good your project is, an editor always likes the project that they've thought of themselves. It's, I suppose that's true of any kind of project, but with translations where you already have the work available, if an editor is interested in foreign literature, they will have an idea of what they want translated. So it never hurts to get to know editors who are who have that interest. That envy I just talked about is an example of this. It was commissioned from me by Edwin Frank at New York Review Books, who I knew, and I knew him through Slavic circles. I knew him. We were just in this. I had met him, and that's why he thought of me. It's because he knew me, and he knew some of the work I had done. All this is kind of not cold-blooded, but calculating maybe. I have to say that very often a text just chooses you. If you're reading in a foreign language, you may come across something that you love so much you may never have thought of translating, but you love this book so much that you may want to share it with people who cannot read that language, your friends. You may be kind of overwhelmed with the desire to try to reproduce it in English. It could be your gateway drug to literary translation. There's a lot of personal passion for literature that goes into being a literary translator. And that's how I came to translate Anna Karenina. We can go to the next slide. In the late 1990s, I reread that novel. I hadn't read it in a long time, in decades probably. I've never considered myself particularly interested in Tolstoy. I've mostly been more interested in the 20th century rather than the 19th. But I read it again with those decades of experience behind me and was absolutely blown away by how Tolstoy had written this book, by the language he used, how he had constructed it, how he had broken rules right and left. At that point, it hadn't been translated for nearly 40 years. There hadn't been a new translation. And the existing translations, not only did they not address Tolstoy's what I thought were stylistic innovations, but they actually corrected Tolstoy, which is an interesting idea. I did some research and got confirmation from his letters that this, what is sometimes characterized as rough writing, was actually quite intentional on his part. This was just before his religious awakening, and he was starting to consider the moral aspect of language. So he was very unhappy with what he considered the facile beauty of Russian. He could write beautiful Russian, but he felt that that was an affectation and was in some way immoral. So he did many things that translators have corrected for over the years. I must say, if you tell a Russian that Tolstoy made mistakes and did things that were bad writing, you might lose an arm or a leg or something. It's not a popular idea to express to a Russian. Whether or not they're aware of what he did as a writer. One of the things he did, which I think of as almost a folk technique, is in this passage that I've put here in this slide. It's the use of repetition. Tolstoy never, in the entire book in all of Anna Karenina, something I can know for sure because I can search it electronically now. If this had been 40 years ago, I wouldn't have known for sure, but I do know now that he never expresses his judgment of people or actions in so many words. He never says that someone is bad. He never says that someone has committed a sin. But he makes it clear, very clear, what he thinks of people's actions. He just doesn't use those kind of easy tags that we're used to. So this passage is from the first paragraph in the book. And for those of you who don't know the story, the book opens with the Oblonsky household being turned upside down because his wife, Steva Oblonsky's wife, had found out that Steva had an affair with the governess. And Tolstoy never says that, oh, Steva shouldn't have done this. Steva was made a bad mistake. Instead, what's important to Tolstoy is the consequence of Steva's action. And the consequence of Steva's action is to turn everything upside down. The first line of the paragraph is, the Oblonsky home was all confusion. This is a reference to the Tower of Babel. And it's the kind of confusion that makes human life a misery, when the order of the proper relations between people get disrupted in this kind of major way. So Steva's wife is very upset, and what Tolstoy writes is, this had been the state of affairs for 3 days now, and it was keenly felt not only by the spouses themselves, but by all the members of the family and the servants as well. All the members of the family and the servants felt that there was no sense in their living together, and that travelers chancing to meet in any inn had more in common than did they, the Oblonsky family members and servants. I'm not going to go too deeply into this, but what I want to point out is that he's repeated the same phrase 3 times. All the members of the family and the servants as well. And then at the end of one sentence, the next sentence starts, all the members of the families and the servants. And that same sentence ends with the family members and the servants. No translation before mine had ever maintained that repetition. And what I understand of this is that this is his way of creating emphasis. It's his way of drawing your attention to what he considers is the most important consequence of this misdeed by Steva. Since then, one other translator has managed to do it, and another translator has said that his editor made him use like a pronoun, like they, or I can't remember what it was, but to me, that's a very important aspect of his style. And it was the kind of approach that I took to the whole book. I said I reread it in 1990, late 90s, started translating it pretty soon after. The book didn't get published until 2014. It was a very long process with lots of twists and turns on the way, but I'm extremely happy with the outcome. So once I wanted to say a little bit about what you do if you do have a project that you're interested in, the practical aspects. One, the most important thing is to determine whether you have the right to translate it. Translation is a subsidiary right. When a work is written, if you write something, it inherently possesses universal rights, so rights to all media and all languages, for whatever the term of copyright is. As a translator, before you can, if you are the one initiating the project, you must determine who owns the rights. I'm not going to go into it. If it's in the public domain, either because it's very old or because it's gone out of copyright, you don't have to worry about it. I will only say, if you have questions about this, we can talk about this more, but the basic answer, your first go-to find out about the rights is to go to the Foreign Rights Department of the original publisher, not the author. The author often is unclear as to, or mistaken as to who owns the rights to translate something into English. Next slide. All this information I have about choosing projects, publishing projects, finding editors, learning about copyright. I learned this from my colleagues. There are books about it, but I personally learned it from people and from other translators. Since you're here today, you obviously appreciate the value of an organization, well, like the Writers League. I can't overemphasize the value of the same kind of organizations for literary translators. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about the ones that are available in the United States. Some of them are literary subdivisions of other organizations. This would be the American Translator Association has a literary division. PEN has a translation committee. And the Authors Guild has recently added a translator category to its membership, which is excellent because it gives you members of the Authors Guild can have their contracts reviewed by their lawyers. Also here if you happen to be in Austin, we have a literary special interest group that is part of the Austin Area Translators and Interpreters Association. We meet 5 or 6 times a year, lately on Zoom, and we share professional news, we workshop each other's texts, we workshop each other's proposals. Sometimes we will have a member will talk about the Guadalajara Book Fair or copyright or something else. So it varies, and it's the people who come are all stages, from people who are just thinking about translating up to people who do it all the time like me. And everybody is very warmly welcomed. You have the URL on the screen there. But the most important organization, if you're in the United States, and even if you're outside the United States, is the American Literary Translators Association. That organization is wholly devoted to literary translation and literary translators. It not only supports the translators' work, it also tries to advance the art of literary translation, serving, besides translators, students, teachers, publishers, and just readers of literature and translation. We need more readers of literature and translation. It provides many services. The sort of jewel of the organization is its annual conference, which is next week in Tucson. There was a virtual conference about 3 weeks ago, with some wonderful, absolutely fantastic sessions, which you can view. Many were recorded, and information on how to access those recordings from the virtual conference are on the website, on the ALTA website. ALTA offers programs for younger translators. It has a travel fellowship, which allows young, usually students, not always, beginning translators or early career translators to come to the conference and to do a reading. And we have the emerging translator mentorships, which is a program that I'm involved with. I mentor one person a year in Russian prose. And ALTA awards 4 translation prizes, which are the only translation prizes, well, except maybe MLA, that actually look at the original text. Most translation prizes don't look at the original text, which is why you get some strange choices sometimes. Plus, there are many resources available on the website. Most of all, it's at the ALTA conference that you find like-minded people. It's a very generous and welcoming place. There's a tremendous amount of knowledge to be had just sitting at the bar and talking to people. Not only how to choose a text or translate it, how to get it published. You may have a drink with the editor who is going to publish your next book. I can't recommend it highly enough. So I've covered a lot of ground here in a short time. I hope I've answered some of your questions and at least piqued your interest in translating, and especially reading foreign literature. So if anyone has any questions, I'd love to talk to you about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I have such a deep appreciation for literary translation and the important work that you do. So thank you. So let's get into the Q&A to our audience. If you have any lingering questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A box and we'll get to as many as we can. First up, is it hard to translate without wanting to make the source text better in English than it was originally?
My experience is that no editor has ever faulted anyone for improving a text. One would hope that the original text was so wonderful that you didn't have to improve it. If it's something that needs a lot of improving, maybe that's not a good book to translate. Now, if it's something you're commissioned to do, yeah, it's often even. I mean, if you think of how a text is edited anyway by a copy editor, that kind of improvement. But I did a book, there was a book I had a long history with. It was one I got an NEA for. The author published it in various formats for over several years. But when I finally submitted the grant for the NEA, Gallimard was going to publish it in French. And Gallimard said to her, "This is too long, you've got to cut it." So she said, okay, she's a real pro. And she cut it, not by cutting sections, but by cutting individual words. She cut it by a third, a very long novel by a third. So by the time I got the grant, I said, that book was out, and I said, I'm translating the French text, and not from French, but the text the French use, because it's a better text. Some countries don't edit very well. Russian is one of those countries. Their publishers do not edit. These texts get published as the writer wrote them, which shows. Sometimes it shows. So yes, there is leeway. The short answer is yes, there's leeway for improving text. You can go too far.
Yeah, that's amazing. I had no idea that there weren't like people editing books in other places like that. That's insane. Okay, so next question for beginning translator, is it better to start with a work from a living author?
Some of that's your temperament. I started with only dead writers because I didn't want to have to deal with them. I just didn't want to have to talk to them. It was I was just not prepared to talk to dead writers, to living writers. And I think that probably, well, that depends on you. It depends on the relationship. It can be very good because living writers can tell you more about the text. On the other hand, if they think they know English, which some of them do, they can make your life a misery. Or if they have a nephew who knows English, God forbid, who tells them that this is wrong and you can't do it that way. It's, you've got to be educated in the language that you're writing in. And just because you know some English doesn't mean you're very helpful. But yes, I do enjoy working with living writers. For a beginner, it depends on how good you are with relationships. If you think you can really hold your own. One of the first living writers I worked with, I insisted on speaking English the whole time because it was the only thing I was better at. I mean, I could have spoken Russian with her, but she was so intimidating and impressive that I would have been just a mouse compared to her. And I felt the power imbalance would be too great. I was pretty young then. So yes, if you can get a lot out of working with a living writer, but it's not necessarily better.
Yeah, thank you. That's great advice and a lot to consider. Next question. As a freelancer, who sets your rate? Do you tell the publisher what you charge, or do they tell you what they pay?
Well, literary translators all take a vow of poverty. I mean, it's the worst paid kind of translation. And it lags, it never follows inflation, whereas I think commercial translation does. Yes, you need to, how can I put this? There are ranges for every language that people tend to be able to accept. If you have more reputation, you can ask for more. Sometimes the translator's payment is from a grant from a foreign country. That kind of limits it. But there are, publishers who will just say, this is what I'm paying. And if you don't want it, then I'll find someone else. I don't think any translators have ever been very good at advocating for themselves and getting decent rates. We don't have decent rates. It's terrible. And it's such a small market. There's so few books translated in this country that there's just a lot of competition. There's a lot of people who could do it, who the publishers think can do it. Whether they can or not is another question.
Thank you. All right, next question. Can you translate any book that looks interesting to you? How do you know if a recent translation has already been done? And can you guarantee that you will be paid? As in, do you get contracted to do the work before you do it so that you know there's a publisher in it?
Right. You find out if it's been translated before by going to Amazon.com or going to the library. Do your research. Translation involves a lot of research. So you've got to find out, you got to do the legwork and see if it's been translated before. If this is your idea, you need to determine whether the rights are available. You don't acquire them, but you contact whoever holds them, usually the Foreign Rights Department, and you say, I'm a translator, are the rights available? I want to, try to sell this book in English. And they will write back to you. If they don't write back to you and you try it like 3 times over a few months and they haven't responded, you've done your due diligence and you can just go ahead. You also, but if it's a famous writer, you really need to, famous writers, or you might ask the author too, if it's a living writer or the family. There have been just so many stories of heartbreak of people who have gone ahead and translated a book without knowing whether they whether the rights are available or whether someone else is already translating it. Someone may be in the process of translating it. I can't overemphasize the need for caution in that respect. So yes, if a publisher accepts the book, whether they first acquire the book by acquiring the rights and then look for a translator, there will be a separate, there's a contract with the author or the rights holder and of the original work. And then there's a separate contract with the translator to have rights to your translation. So in that, it'll spell out payment schedules, everybody's obligations, what the amounts are, what the royalties are, how many free copies you get, all the things that are any kind of book contract would say. Yeah.
Thank you. And this will be our last question for the evening. Who reads your translation afterward to determine if you did a good or accurate job?
The critics, if it's a classic, you have to be ready for the academics to go after you pretty mercilessly. Somehow they're rarely happy. Well, nobody, you mean at some publishers with good conscience, and I always appreciate them, will send it out for a reader's report. And this will be someone who's in the field and who knows the literature. That's pretty rare, but it does happen. It tends to be university presses that do that. But I mean, things get published. It's just amazing what gets published sometimes as translations. Not mine. Mine are all.
You're amazing. Well, thank you so much. Yes, this was so insightful. That's it for tonight, but I hope you all have a good night. And thank you so much, Marian, for being here.
Thank you. It was fun. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.